We're going to look at a topic of relationships. Not specifically a Valentine's Day message, and yet certainly can be. But I want to offer a few disclaimers, one of them being that we're not just talking about relationships in the context of marriage here this morning. We're talking much more broadly than that. We're looking not at the typical marriage relationship passages. We're looking still in Matthew's gospel at some of the more radical teachings of Jesus. We're looking specifically still in the Sermon on the Mount. It seems like once we started there, we're having a hard time getting out of that sermon because there's just so much there for us. And it's not so much that this sermon the Sermon on the Mount has lots that would just shout at us about relationships. It's more that when we look a little closer at what's there through the lens of relationships, it's amazing what we see. And so that's really what I want to encourage us to do this morning. If you're married, yes, that's a good place to start, is to look at what we're going to be looking at this morning through the lens of that relationship. But maybe there are other relationships that would come into focus for you this morning. Maybe there are some relationships you're struggling with in some form or another. It could be a friend. It could be a family member. Maybe there are relationships you're questioning, whether it's a healthy relationship for you. Maybe you're dating or considering dating, and there's just a lot of different ways to look at this. And I want to make clear at the outset that the Sermon on the Mount, I believe, is in general, and specifically in our application this morning, is, I believe, not intended to be a tool for harsher judgment of others. Okay? It can become that if we're not careful, because there's so much in this sermon where Jesus says, "It has been said," or "You have heard, but I say to you," and he really, in a sense, and from one perspective, increases the demands of what God asks of us. In some ways, he makes it even more difficult to live up to. Now, I don't think that's the intention, but it has that effect, and that can become a dangerous tool in our hands if our focus is finding fault with other people. Because now the bar has been raised, and it's even easier to find fault. It's even easier to judge others. And that's not just a challenge for us individually, but even corporately. Sometimes churches have come to the Sermon on the Mount and have taken it as that type of a tool. And it becomes a very legalistic thing within the body to judge and to condemn and to enforce. And that, I don't believe, is its intention. Really, I think the intention is to help us focus. It's topics to help us reflect on our own heart and help us understand that even in giving of the law in the Old Testament, God's concern was always for the heart. When our focus is on keeping rules and keeping the law, are we thinking more of myself or another person? Now, it may not be easily obvious or immediately obvious, but think of the attitude that becomes filled with pride at keeping the law. I mean, none of us would go there, of course. We think of Jesus' story of the two men in the temple, and the one who stood tall and proud and was able just to check off the boxes of the law, and he was so self-righteous in his attitude. God, you should be so happy with me. Look at what I haven't done, and look at what I have done. And yet the heart seems so missing in that passage. And Jesus is helping us to see that what God really wants, the intention of the law, was really to ultimately reach our heart. However, it gets a little tricky here this morning. While I want us to be focusing on ourselves in the midst of relationships, I know there are circumstances where there are abusive relationships, whether in marriage or in other marriages. And I don't want you to hear that God's solution in every situation is for the one who's being abused just to try harder. And even as we're called to reflect on ourselves, that there's often a bigger context than that. And I want us to hear that very clearly, that where there is abuse, and I know there's sometimes we might call something abuse that isn't, but I want to be real careful. Where there is physical abuse, where there is clear abusive behavior, sometimes the first step is to remove ourselves from that situation. And I don't want us to mishear that, even while we're inviting God to look at our hearts, because sometimes that's what's going on. And while there's still things that are going to apply, and there's still God's calling for each of us to look at ourselves and to be the person God's called us to be, that doesn't always solve everything. And I also want to add the disclaimer, and I know it sounds like it's all disclaimers until we get started. But I think it's important also that even though this is not intended to be a tool for us to use against other people, it can be a tool for discernment. And I want to think, especially young people, as we're either choosing friends or as you're considering who to date, and as you're exploring those important decisions in life, it can be a tool to look at another person, not with judgment, but to try to evaluate, to try to understand the kind of love that God calls us to in relationships. And there may be times with a friendship, a dating relationship, where you need to take a good look at this and see in another person. It doesn't mean we automatically write it off necessarily, but this can help us sometimes in those kinds of discernments as well. To say, wow, I got caught up in this relationship, or I thought this friendship was really going to be a healthy thing for me, but now I'm beginning to see some real unhealthy patterns here. And that bears looking at as well. So I promise we won't be here all day, but let's jump in. And I want to go back right to the beginning just for a moment, because I think it'll help us get in the frame of mind of what it means to look through the lens of relationship. I want to walk briskly through the Beatitudes. And I want us to think about what Jesus says here. Blessed are, fortunate are, oh how lucky are, and this list of people that kind of goes against what we would think the way the world works. But I want us to hear this in terms of relationships. And I'm going to play a little game with it. In each case, we might question, let's just say the first one, blessed are the poor in spirit. We might use the term broken in spirit. Kind of the opposite of pride and self-sufficiency. And I'm going to say, if you are not what Jesus is commending, if you are not poor in spirit, if you are not broken, somehow in your own spirit, broken, aware of your own struggles, of failings, aware of your own hurts, if there's not some aspect of brokenness inside of you that you have owned and are aware of, then it is more likely that you are one who is breaking the spirits of others. You understand where I'm headed with this? Well, that's a little new way of looking at it, isn't it? If there's no humility, no brokenness in your spirit, you're probably causing it in other people in a way that's not healthy. Blessed are those, fortunate are those who are mourning, who are grieving. I would say if you don't understand what it's like to grieve over hurts, over the pain of others, if that just has no place in your heart and spirit, in your relationships, to be able to grieve in the midst of that, then it is a little more likely, and I'm not saying as an absolute rule, but it is more likely that you are causing grief for others. If you are not meek, if you are not humble, you are more likely arrogant and self-serving. If you are not hungering for righteousness, if there's not that within you which longs to do what is right by others, by God, then it is more likely that you are willing to do whatever in order to get whatever it is that you're hungering for. You understand the difference there? If you're not hungering for what is right, you're more likely willing to compromise what is right, to do whatever it takes to get what you're hungering for, whatever possessions, whatever esteem, whatever it is that you're hungering for in place of righteousness. That's more likely the case. The description of where you are is, again, as we think, what does that mean for relationships? Another way of looking at that is, do you use things in order to help you love people? Or do you use people in order to help you love things? You see the difference? Hungering and thirsting after what is right includes doing what is right by others. Is that the longing of your heart? To love others the way they deserve and the way God desires? Or am I using others to get what I want over here? Blessed are the merciful. If you are not merciful, you're more likely judgmental. Blessed are the pure in heart. If you are not pure in heart, you're more likely living a lie, putting on an act. More likely concerned about outward appearances than what's really in the heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. If you're not actively seeking peace, it's more likely that you're contributing to discord. Blessed are the persecuted. If you're not among the persecuted, it's more likely that you're causing harm to others, in some form gaining from someone else's pain. Just a way to start us thinking in this line. And then Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount moves from those statements into a lot of case studies, specific situations where he gives some clarification to God's intention. We went through some of these 2 weeks ago, and I'm not going to go through all the same ones. I just want to touch a little bit, just help us understand the heart of this, again, through the lens of relationship. The very first one, he says, "You have heard long ago it was said to people, 'Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment,' and so forth. But I tell you, do not be angry. Anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Anyone who calls his brother a fool or you idiot," and so forth. Understand here that on the one hand, the person who's focused on the law says, well, hey, I'm fine in all my relationships. My marriage is fine. I haven't killed her yet. And we laugh. I mean, more often I haven't killed him yet, perhaps. And yet you can understand how a law-centered approach prides ourselves in what we haven't done and completely misses the heart of anger and resentment and ridiculing and putting down demeaning behavior. And God calls us to account for it all. These are not easy teachings. They make us all squirm a little bit. Come down the list to divorce. That makes us squirm. It makes me squirm. It's such a reality in the world we live in. It's such a reality within the church. And Christians have struggled with how to even talk about this. And this is one of the areas where I know of a lot of churches that have heard what Jesus said. He says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness, I think I said that wrong, causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. And if we take the approach that this is a tool for judgment, And suddenly we find the guilty all over the place. And I know of churches that would go to the point that say, well, no, this is what God says. And so what he says is if there's been divorce, the only way to be pleasing to God is to then separate from that new partner and to go back to the original partner, because anything else is adultery. And they can make a case from this. I'm not sure that that's what God's saying here. We think of this rule-keeping mentality, and we understand that what was happening in the Old Testament was that they had this thing called a certificate of divorce. And we read later that Jesus said when questioned that Moses allowed that because of the hardness of the people's heart, that even that was not really God's intention and design. But because left to their own, men would divorce their wives with no thought for their wives' welfare, and they lived in a time when a woman could not provide for her own needs. And somehow by divorcing her, and I don't understand it all, but somehow just kicking her out of the house left her with no means to provide for herself, left her unmarriable. I'm having such a hard time with my words this morning. And somehow this bill of divorce was giving her at least some protection in society, was somehow allowing someone else to marry her and to protect her and provide for her. And we understand a little bit how Jesus said this was because of the hardness of your heart. You're going to do it anyhow, and I'm providing through Moses a way to at least protect the victim here in that culture, in that setting. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's always a victim. I know it takes two people to build a marriage, and when it doesn't survive, there's usually things on both sides that people could have done differently. But what I want us to look at here is, again, the difference between the law and the heart. And I think what this is saying here, and there's room for other conversations about other scriptures and so forth, but I think what's happening here in this passage, again, is contrasting a rule-keeping mindset with a heart mindset, or a heart set, we might say. The rule-keeping which says in that time and in that day, hey, I gave her the certificate of divorce, I did what the law required. Hey, that's all. I'm sleeping at night, that's all I have to worry about. And Jesus is saying, but have you thought about the other people involved? Are you really thinking about the other person? Are you thinking about the place you've put them in? Are you thinking about that in terms of their heart and the commitment that person made to you, that now you're putting them in a position to dishonor their vows to you? Putting a woman out where her only recourse is to marry someone else, and now maybe it wasn't her intention or her desire, and she marries someone else, and from a certain perspective now you're putting her in a position of betraying her marriage vows. And whoever is marrying her, it's complicating things, and your actions are having impact on other people. And when we step back and look at it, what God is calling us to is to not just look at the law, but to consider how are my actions impacting the hearts and lives of the people around me. And I'm going to bring this right up to today, and I know this is uncomfortable, and please, this is not meant, again, as a tool for judgment for other people. This is not meant in any way, whether collectively or individually. It's not meant as a topic to increase embarrassment or shame. Because I think perhaps in some ways the people who need to hear this the way the original hearers heard it, or needed to hear it, are those people who might be sitting back and say, whew, I dodged that one. I'm not divorced. Whereas what Jesus is calling us to is to look at our hearts and to not be satisfied by squeaking in under the letter of the law, but to say, what about your heart? Is every day your heart taking responsibility for the hearts of the other people in your lives. The ways that your actions can damage and wound another heart. Are you concerned more about that than about your image in relation to the law? And boy, that has a wide, sweeping application to touch each and every one of us this morning. I think that's a big part of the way we need to hear the words of Jesus here, not only in this passage, but in the others to follow. How about the eye for an eye section? You've heard that it was said, verse 38 in chapter 5, an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth. Think about that in the context of our important relationships. How often do we get caught up into retaliating, to feeling justified in treating another person a certain way because of what we receive from them? Well, this is the setting where we hear this turn the other cheek part. He says, you've heard, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If someone wants to sue you for your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. And again, room for all kinds of caveats here. The question is just to look at our hearts and who God calls us to be. And to consider how this can apply in relationships. If our mindset is always doing back in measure with what was done to me, it may sound fair. It may sound reasonable. In a court of law, you might actually be considered justified, and you might be cleared in a court of law, but Jesus says, I'm calling you to another way of living. A way that's not keeping score. It goes right into the love for enemies. It says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. That way you'll be reflecting the heart and character of your Father in heaven. How does that apply within our relationships? Even when there's cause to part ways, whatever the relationship was, what's our heart in that? Do we pray for those who have caused us pain? We still be a channel of God's love in some way to care about what happens to them genuinely and deeply. Friends who have betrayed us in some way can... You say, but it's not fair after what this person did to me. But you see, it's not just about them and their story. Can we trust them to God? Some of it's about us and about who God calls us to be and freeing us from those burdens that we carry, those resentments, those getting all caught up and tied up. And He wants to free us from that. And what a freedom it is to be able to love, to pray for those who have hurt us in deep and meaningful ways. Passage, we move on through the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 7 about judging others. Boy, this one hits close to home. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And then here comes this familiar passage. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when at the same time there was a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, then you'll be able to see clearly to help remove the speck from your brother's eye. Obviously, talking about your brother it's not primarily addressing the context of marriage, but I think that helps us, again, to broaden it in any relationship. How quick we are to focus on the faults, the shortcomings of others in any relationship, and to justify our actions. God calls us to focus on ourselves, on what we can do, what we can control. We can't control another person. But what can we do to consider how we contribute to the discord, how we contribute to the problem in the relationship? Oh, how I remember so often a couple of our kids coming, and I mean, obviously it wouldn't have been Karis or Noah. No, I think they were all involved in different ways. And there'd be some conflict, some fight, and what do children always want to establish? Yeah. Who was to blame? Who started it? Whose fault it was? They come before the court of mom or dad, and that's all the focus. And of course, if you've been a parent, you know how difficult it is to unravel everything and to get to the heart of who really started it. And that was not really the whole point. And how often we would just say, time out. I want each of you to think really hard. And I'd ask if they could tell me the question, but I don't want to set either of us up for what that, if they don't remember or whatever, but I remember what we tried to communicate that I hope they remember. Is Noah, what could you have done differently? Karis, what could you have done differently? I commend that question to all of us. In any conflict, it's not about fixing the blame. It's about learning. It's about considering what speck or beam. Let's not get caught up in measuring and seeing which is bigger. That's not the point here. The point is that sometimes it is a log in our eye, and we're there trying to nitpick some little thing in someone else, and we're completely blind to what we're bringing to the relationship. Maybe it is a beam in the other person's eye, and it's a speck in ours, but sometimes it can make a big difference to acknowledge the speck and to give some attention to that as well. What could you have done differently? One more phrase in here, and there's a lot of other places we could go, even in this sermon. Chapter 7, verse 12. We shared it. Chuck read it in our responsive reading this morning. Kind of a summary statement. So, therefore, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. That's the heart God calls us to have in relation to others. Not to get caught up in rights, not to get caught up in law, not to get caught up in yes, but she did or he said or whatever, but to have a heart that's open to people and that's considering how my actions impact their heart and how I would want to be treated, and consider that first and foremost in every relationship. May God help us to look at our hearts. May God help us to not get all beat up over where we failed, but to be honest, to let God pick us back up, stand us on our feet, to help us to learn and to grow from wherever we are, and to help us be a channel of His love from our hearts in every relationship He brings us to.